Hi everyone, I'm going to do a little demonstration of how to use Flexbox. This video assumes that you've gone through that CSS tricks article that I posted, the complete guide to Flexbox. This is a really awesome article that I use pretty frequently for work. There's no way to memorize everything that you could possibly do with Flexbox. It's a really complicated module, but it's extremely useful, and I definitely recommend bookmarking this link because you'll use it a lot going forward. So if you haven't read this, read the background, read this basics and terminology uh, section, and then you can use all these images for reference going forward. Alright, I'm going to jump back here to Dablet. Today I'm going to take the content that we had for our homework and redo it with Flexbox. So when we're done, we'll have done it with a fixed layout. We'll have done it with a fluid layout using floats, and now we're going to do it a fluid layout using Flex. So this is the basic HTML that you might have for some of this. You have your header, you have a div with a class of content, and then we have an aside and a main inside of that, and then a footer. So before, what we might have done to get this floated correctly, we learned the border box, or box sizing. Border box was one thing we had to do. We needed that on the content class. We needed the overflow, auto, clear both, and then on the aside, we had to do width, maybe 30%, float left. On the main, have a width of 70%, and a float right. Okay. What math did I just do? With 70. I need the rest of it. Okay. This kind of gets us back to that float that we started out with. This is not what you need for Flex, and you might be sad when you see the amount of content that it actually takes to get this up. So I'm going to go ahead and take this all back out. Alright, so this is where we started. So the whole point of the Flexbox module was to come up with an easier way to do these one-dimensional layouts other than just using floats. Because floats, as you know, can be confusing, and they don't always do what you want them to, especially when it comes to setting the heights of the floated items. It can be a little confusing. So they came out with Flex a few years ago, and by this point it's gotten pretty well adopted in the major browsers. There might be a few that still don't have it, but for the most part it's pretty safe to use in our web browsers today. So in order to get started with Flex, if you remember from this article, you need to define your Flex container. So let me get down to there, close these up. The Flex container is going to be the parent. So we have our div with a class of content. This container is going to have a number of items, and these are the Flex items. So if you compare this to our float example, you had the container, your float container that held all of your floated items. So this could be the sidebar, maybe the main content, and some other column. So if I go back over here, I'm going to be setting the display to Flex on that container. Alright, gotta make our container again. If I can hit the correct button. Sorry about that. Alright, content. And now we're going to set this to Flex. Alright. So when you look up at the top, you might notice that automatically this looks pretty much what we wanted for the homework. For Flex, we had to do all those settings of the widths and the heights and the border box and the floats. I wrote one line here, and it looks pretty much what we wanted for the homework. So what's happening here is you're making this into the Flex container. These two automatically become Flex items. So there's a lot of CSS under the hood happening right now. A lot of default CSS that's set that is allowing this to happen. So one of the ones that's set by default is Flex Wrap, and the default property for this is no wrap. And flex wrap property just says how these items should display in this row. So if you think of this row as being the main axis, if you remember from the reading that article, it talks about the main axis and the cross axis. In this case, the main axis is being displayed as a row. I can actually do that one in here. So flex direction is another property, and it defaults to row. So the flex direction is just the direction in which the flex flow goes. So in this case, it's going to be a row. This is the default. There are some other ones that I could change this to, like column. So now the flex direction is going to be going in the direction of this column. This is now the main axis. Instead of when it was a row, it went this way. Going back to row for a second, we have row reverse. So the direction, the main axis is still row, but now this is the start, and it's going this way. If I change this to column, this is now the main axis because it's a column, and the flex start is down here. So back to flex wrap, now that I got that out of the way. Well, actually, let's switch this back to row, which is the default. I'll make a note here. It's in the article. Alright, moving on. Flex direction is going to be set to the row here, and the flex wrap by default is going to be set to no wrap. And what this means is that by default, these flex items are going to all try to fit on this same page. So if I add another direct child under here, it's going to jump up on that same page. You can't really see it because it's just one character, so I'm going to put that in there. Now you can see there's 3. Now there's 4. I can do this, any number of times. And it'll just keep squishing all of them onto this same row. That's what this no wrap does here. If I change this to wrap, it's going to try to move them and wrap them around. Like if you think about if you're using some notepad and you're typing and it goes off the edge of the screen and just keeps going, that's no wrap. But when the text goes down to the next line automatically, that's wrap. So that's what's happening with the items in the flex here. So just for the example, I'll do a border around each of these blocks here. So you can see each of these fit as many as they could, and then they wrap to the next line. Alright, so let's get rid of these paragraphs. And we'll leave this at no wrap for now, because we don't want them wrapping to the next line. Alright, so what else can we do in Flexbox? Let's go back here. We covered flex direction, covered flex wrap. Let's talk about justify content. Justifying content is something that's pretty cool. Let me think for a sec. I'm going to get rid of some of these other main layout items. Actually, I think I'll get rid of these paragraphs as well and just make some little divs under here. Make this, switch this up and do some different naming conventions. Okay, so we got our parent. Let's get rid of the header too. Now we'll leave it in. Okay, and then we'll do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We'll do 6. Okay, now we can get started. So we have six blocks here. You might notice something different from when I had those 2 columns up. By default, one of these flex items, the width is going to be the width of the content, plus, of course, the padding in there. and so these aren't going to take up the full width of the screen. When I had that aside and the main in here, it took up the full width, but that's because there was so much content in that main section that it filled up as much space as it possibly could. So that's going to be a big difference there. If we did want them to take up the full width of the screen, we can use a property called FlexGrow. So let me jump to that real quick. All right, FlexGrow here. This defines the ability for a flex item to grow if necessary. So it's a unit list value that serves as a proportion. So what this means is that if I go over here and on the flex item on the child, I change this to flex 1. What this is saying is that each of these children are going to take up this proportion of the web page. Because all of them are set to 1, all of them are going to have the same proportion that they take up. So let's say I want 2 to be double. So let me add a class here called double. And then I can go down here, double, and say I want this one to take up twice the amount that everything else is. Alright, so 2. So now if I look at it, you got 1 taking up what's a proportion of what's left, and these are all going to be the same. And then this one is set to 2, so it's going to take up twice the amount that it would normally be allowed to if it was just in the normal position. Say I want to add that double class to 5. So now it's also taking up double what it would normally be allowed to. So if I remove this, 2 is going to be this width. If I add it in here, you can see that 2 got smaller because it had to allow space for 5 to also proportionally take up that amount. Does that make sense? If it doesn't make sense, I would recommend rereading that article and asking a question in the channel, whatever you need to do to make sure that sinks in. So you can make this any number. So say I wanted one of them to be triple. I'll set this to flex 3, and then let's change this one to triple. So now this one's taking up 3/4 of the space that everything else is. You could do this flex 4, flex 5, so on and so forth. So let's get rid of that again. Alright, so now we're back to normal. Say we set a width on each of these. Say we want it to be, what about 200 pixels? Oh, I gotta take this out. Flex is overriding that. Alright, say we want these to be, let's try 100 pixels. Okay, I was trying to get it to be less than the width here. So we have these 6 items, and then we have some space over here. There are some properties that you can set that changes how these are arranged. By default, these are going to be arranged using justify content flex start, meaning that all of the items that are in this parent are going to start at the beginning of the row. Remember that main axis we talked about? It's going to start at the beginning and go towards the end. So if I change, so this is the default. If I change this to flex end, now they're going to start lining up at the end here. Alright, so it's going to start here with the last one and then go this way. There are a bunch of these. If I want to do space around, this is a cool thing where it automatically lines these up, and then it sets equal margins on either side. So you have this width, and then you have that same width on this side. You can't really see, but this is technically where these two would be split up. And then you have this space, and then you have this space and this space, this space and this space, so on, and then you have it again at the end. So that's a really cool way of setting up items centered like this, or at least proportionally laid out in this way. This would be so hard to do with a float. There's another one called space between, and what this does is it lines the first one up in the far left and the last one up in the far right, and then it takes whatever space is left and divides it between the rest of the items. This one is super useful in layout if you're doing some kind of like a bunch of columns and you want them to all to be proportional like that, this is a really helpful one. I use this one a lot. And something else that's cool about actually most of these project or properties with Flex is that they are fluid. So if I make this smaller, you can see that they're automatically staying in line like that, which is pretty cool. Okay, let's see what else. There are a number of justify contents that you could set. Yeah, here they are. So we also have center. I showed you this flex start. This is a default. Flex end means it's going to start where the end of the main axis is and go this way. Here, I'll show you center real quick. Space center. Yep, so now they're going to be in the middle. I showed you this one, I showed you this one. Space evenly is kind of exactly what it sounds like. It's going to determine how much space exists and just fill it in all around like that. We'll leave it with space between for now. Alright, I'm going to switch out these numbers for some variable content lengths. So I'm going to grab some lorem ipsum. Just do one. I hate how this formats this. Just copy and paste these. Okay, and then I'm going to change some of these so they're longer or shorter. Just bear with me while I do this. Okay. Oops. Make this one a little bit shorter than the previous. Basically, I'm just trying to get each paragraph to be a different length. Okay, and we'll leave that last one as a really long one. Okay, so now I can show you this align items property. Let me go to show you this right here. This is what I'm going to show you. Align items. So these orange ones are all the items that go underneath. By default, I think it's stretch. Yeah, stretch is the default. So when we lined up the sidebar and the main content in the first example, the heights matched. That's because it automatically applies this stretch to them. So by default, we got this here, meaning each of these divs here are going to take up the same height. They're going to all go to match the biggest height so that they can all fit and look nice in there. But this can be changed, and then these are all the different ones that you can change it to. Alright, so we can change it to, let's try flex start. So now they no longer have all of the same heights. They are going to take up the content that is needed, or you'll see the border go around the content that is displayed, but they're all going to be really strictly aligned to the top here. If I do end, they're all going to be strictly aligned to the bottom. There are a bunch of them. We can do center. So now they're all going to be centered. So it's an interesting way of setting things up. Maybe if you have a bunch of images here and you want them to all be displayed at their own height, but maybe all in a centered line, that'd be a use case for that. What I really want you to get out of here is that Flex is a really great way of coming up with layouts, and it solves a lot of issues that we ran into with floats. It can be a pretty big intellectual leap from talking about floats to understanding how all of these things work. And so, like I said, you'll never remember all of this, and so I want you to think of this as your Flexbook Bible that you refer back to whenever you're working on these, whenever you're working on any kind of layout with Flex. This site has a ton of information such as browser support. This is a way of seeing which browsers support it, and you can see that they're mostly green, which means that almost all of them do at this point. So I encourage you to play around with these. I'll give you a few exercises that'll give you some practice with these, and yeah, let me know if you get stuck on any of it.